I'm here to talk about APIs. How many of you are sitting here because it says APIs in the title? See? I do that every time now. How many of you are hiring? Anybody? Anybody hiring? There's one. Anybody else hiring? I like to ask who's hiring rather than who's looking to get hired, because you might be sitting next to your coworker who doesn't know. Are you looking? I'm not looking. No, I got a great job and love it. Right? All right. So I've been doing a lot of research lately, and the research that I've been doing is, how come you guys are leaving all these public endpoints out there that have things on them that I can use to attack you? That's the question, right? So here's first of all, does anybody work for BMW? All right. So this is BMW's website, CD-U. All right. So this is one of their websites, right? And if I go to the domain entry, I get a 404 error, right? What happens if I go to that domain entry, but I start to look for a resource, one that I know may be there? How do I find these things? Well, I've got a neat little word list and a bunch of domains out there. So this is the problem that I'm here to talk about, right? I can go to websites all over the place and I can find resources I shouldn't be able to find, right? And I'm going to go into a couple more of them as I go through my talk, but it definitely is one of those things that we all need to have a little bit of consciousness about. So having said all that, it's me. My name's Jason. If you haven't seen me speak before, I've spoke at this conference a bunch of times. I think it's my first time in this room, but this may be the last room I've done. You know, I think I've done them all now. So I work for Sequence Security. We do API protection, so obviously I'm in the API space quite a bit, but I have been for a long time. First talk I did here was on the Chamberlain garage door API. I opened my garage, and then a friend of mine in California, I called him up and said, hey, I need the ID number off the box on your garage door opener just for a sec. And then I opened his garage, and he's like, how do you do this stuff? And I said, it's API security, man. Last year, I had a groundhog eating my cucumbers. Well, I had something eating my cucumbers. I had no idea what it was. And so I bought one of those little security cameras, you know, you hook it to the Wi-Fi and plug it in the walls like a baby monitor, and signed up for the account. I found the APIs, ended up in a responsible disclosure with them on a flaw that I found that I promised I wouldn't talk about. But I will say this, if your error message says bad password, it's way easier to enumerate good passwords. I've written a couple of different AppSec tools. Probably the one that you might have used is I taught an OWASP class last summer on how to take apart APK files, pull APIs out of them, and then go attack them, right? I'm extending that a little bit with, you don't have to do that because I found their Swagger files and we can just have them tell us where the endpoints are. I do things with OWASP and ISSA and all of that. Why are we talking about this? People get breached. Anybody hear about the Peloton breach? Did you guys hear about it? A few people did. When the researcher found the problem at Peloton, he contacted Peloton and said, I found a problem. And they said, so? And so he contacted a reporter and said, I found your information on Peloton. And the reporter said, I would love to do a story about that. And that's an example of you don't get to control the narrative at some point, right? BrewDog, you could get basically unlimited coupons, right? You could just enumerate through people's accounts, find people that had coupons and print the coupons out, and just walk into BrewDog and get free beer. Free as in beer. Smart door locks. Very much in the same vein of my attack on the Chamberlain garage door API, this guy found that, you know those smart door locks, the ones that they say, hey, you can just let your UPS guy right in. When you do that, you can horizontally privilege escalate and become admin, add all the accounts you want, and anybody can get in, right? And this is all happening on the API surface. This is all applications that are out there that have problems. Look at Experian, Clubhouse, right? It just goes on and on. John Deere had multiple problems, right? Their APIs were easily accessed, but also they decided, hey, do you know where you can get a copy of a database that looks like our production database? In production, you just copy it, right? And the devs were on there and they're like, we see all the tractor owners and everything. All right, so how did we end up here, right? API security, somebody asked me about this the other day and I said, remember in 2013 when suddenly web security was a thing and people were just getting owned left and right? API security is about at that age, right? We're right about there. And it's not for us trying, right? We've been trying. We have code reviews and we've got all of these different things that are in this stack of security, right? We started with code reviews. And then we started doing code reviews automatically, right? Using something like a static analysis tool. And from there, then we moved into, well, we need to hit it on the dynamic side though. We need to actually hit the stood up site. We'll pen test it, right? And so we moved to that kind of thing. And people still do all this stuff. We get some dynamic analysis out there, though in APIs it's a little less simple to do dynamic analysis because you don't know where the next API endpoint is, right? Unless you can tell it somehow with a Swagger file. And so I spent a bunch of time telling people, generate Swagger files. You need to do this so that you can feed your security tools. And then I forgot to tell everybody, but don't make them public. Well, there you go. So we started into that, and now we've got, you know, people saying that we got to go left, right? NASCAR likes to go left. I think it's a DevSecOps. Yeah, we're moving the sec left, I guess, something. We have all of these ideas for security, right? And yet we still end up with all these problems, and there's a reason why. Scanners, dynamic scanners, when they scan a website, they follow the hrefs, right? Humans need to be able to click the next link, so the scanner goes and looks for the next link so it can click it. We don't have sitemaps for APIs unless they're in your Swagger file, right? Or something like that. You've got to have something to tell us where all the API endpoints are. It's possible that you could do this through an automated tool, grabbing an APK for your mobile app, decomposing it, pulling out all of the anything with a slash, right, and do that. It's possible. Less likely, though. I don't know if it was Matt's talk yesterday or somebody's talk yesterday talked about, no, it wasn't Matt, it was another guy, but he talked about just do the deltas, right? Look at your APK files for your mobile app from the last version and this version and pen test the deltas, scan the deltas. That makes the list a lot smaller. But we have to be able to teach the endpoints somehow. We can do this automatically if we're in line, right? Nginx logs are nice. They can give us all the endpoints people are going to. So that's a really nice dynamic way to kind of figure this out. But we don't have really good ways to do this, and this is the challenge that we have, right? So if you have an API, you're probably going to have tools touching it, and you're probably going to have humans touching it in some way, right? So both tools and humans need a map. They got to be able to figure out how to get to these things. Tools a little easier, maps aren't. So what kind of documents are created, right, for APIs? Now, think about this. When you're documenting an API, you're going to publish this to someone or something. The idea is if you want users to come use your API, if that's what you're in the business of, you have to produce documentation that's going to explain to them how to use it. A lot of people do things like curl and Python examples, you know, in a little web page, nice and easy, documented. And that makes it all simple. Great, then I know how to make proper calls, which is a huge part of trying to figure out how to recon an API, is figuring out how do I authenticate and use the thing, right? But I also need to know where are all the endpoints. So there are different kinds of API documentation that are out there. API docs are usually consumed by either humans or developers that are in line with whatever this product that they're trying to extend, right? Typically, there's a lot of getting started kind of things in here, but most importantly, there's syntactically correct calls, right? So you can see the methods and the calls that you can do to get there. This, though, has a little bit of effort that goes with it, right? Somebody's got to actively maintain these things in order for it to work. API definitions, like Swagger and things like that, you create these to tune something else, right? Most of you have probably not even heard of this before, right? Anybody hear of an API definition, right? Okay, so if you're creating an Apogee API gateway and you want to tell that gateway what your endpoints look like, you use an API definition, right? So this is an automatic way to tune some piece of machinery that's running in your environment. And then you have an API spec. We called these Swagger files for a while. Now it's called OpenAPI, not Swagger. But all of that terminology, Swagger and OpenAPI, is completely interchangeable. It all still exists in the same places, right? So you can still refer to things as a Swagger file pretty easily. But it explains how the API is going to behave, identifies the objects that are there, how to call those objects, or how to delete those objects, or whatever. And if you can consume this in your DAS scanner, it will tell it where to go, which is nice if you have a good DAS scanner, but it depends. So what do we do to protect ourselves from this? Well, I found a public Swagger file, right? I showed it to you before we started. You remember that? It was back that a few minutes ago. Just seeing if you're there. So I put the Swagger file up on the screen. Well, I found a public API. I found some documentation on it. Heck, I found the spec. Next thing to do is to start poking at this thing, right? Now, I don't have permission to go poking on BMW's website. I just happened to find that. So I'm probably not going to go poking around on their website. But I'll give you examples. But I'll give you examples of how you could go about finding these things, right? APIs Guru, Programmable Web are old sites that have a lot of these things listed out on them. But you can also use things like a reverse proxy to see what is it that's going on in the background when I'm trying to call stuff to figure out where the API endpoints are. Partners. If the target that you have partners with somebody that's going to be sharing their data, I'd be willing to bet there's a partner portal somewhere with API documentation on it. So go look for that. DNS searches. If you look me up on OWASP training pages, you'll find my list of tools that I have to do APK mining. Basically, you're going to go to a website, pull the APK down, and then it's going to rip it apart, and you'll run a big grep on it that'll dump out all of the API endpoints. Pretty nice way to do it. And then there's a site out there called Cracking. And I mentioned Cracking specifically, but there are lots of sites like this. Which one is it? Anybody here work for Domino's Pizza? No? All right. So, because that's the example I'm giving up here. Cracking is a site that shows you how to automatically attack an API. So if you have a specific target and somebody's already generated an attack for them, right, free pizzas, then you go down to Cracking and you download what's called a config file for a tool like Sentry MBA or OpenBullet or one of these framework attack tools. This is you're downloading the config to make that framework work. So I bring this up as a cautionary tale for everyone to say, if you are on this website, you're already under attack and everyone's figured everything out, right? So you definitely have a security incident going on and you need to go address it or lose the money, either way, right? But if you've made it onto this page, somebody's already figured you out. It's a nice little canary, right? To figure out if they've got you. So we find a public API, and then we check to see if it has a spec. And you saw I found a public API, and I put in a really hacker-esque command into the URL bar, right? I had to pull the hood up. You saw me pull my black hoodie out and pull the hood up, right? When I typed Swagger on there and got the Swagger file, right? So it's really difficult and repetitive to do this manually. Not a lot of people are going to want to do this, right? They're not going to want to sit down and, all right, let's see if I can find it. Is it under API docs? You know, which version of OpenAPI are you running? Because that's going to tell me where your Swagger files are because they're sitting on that server. Or do I have to go digging into more things, right? Do I have to go find bigger word lists in order to get through this thing? So I'm going to pause for a few minutes and I'm going to talk about Kite Runner. And Matt brought this up yesterday when he was talking about this. So these guys in Australia came up with this idea that, well, maybe we could just find endpoints by guessing, right? It's like inference scanning. And so what Kite Runner does is it has this massive word list. And just like me typing /swagger, it's going to try that, right? And 1,400 others, right? So it's basically all of the different kinds of implementations of default behaviors that are out there. They've got this programmed into a scanner. And realistically, the scanning solution itself is quite simplistic. The thing that you want out of this is their word lists, right? The directories that they're going after and all of that kind of stuff. And those word lists are, you know, incredibly valuable when you start to look at them. But what I would challenge you to do if you feel like learning something, and I did when I did this, is I went out and ran BigQuery against GitHub. This is how they did it. So follow their blog post, right? Go run BigQuery against GitHub and look at all of the different kinds of spec files that are sitting there, right? There's huge numbers of them. So it dumps these big word lists out, and then you can use them to go attack the target, right? So one of the things that I've been, you know, sort of playing with a lot lately is GraphQL, right? So we're a little off Swagger files, but we're going to be talking about something just as worse. So how many of you guys use GraphQL in your environment? How many of you know what GraphQL is? Okay, so that's about half the room. A couple people have it at work. Here's the funny thing. A lot of the stuff that you install to make your DevOps environments work also have GraphQL endpoints so that you can go query and pull data out of them. So here's a fairly interesting example. This is fly.io. This is, it's not on the screen because I left the PowerPoint running. Just give me a second. All right, this is fly.io. So I use this as an example because I saw some YouTube video of a guy hacking GraphQL and I was like, wow, they leave that on. But this is a really great site because they're demonstrating GraphQL. So it's not like you can do anything to them. It's just a way for you to do like, you know, introspection queries and stuff like that. So here we are, fly.io. So I think to myself, well, I wonder, is there an API dot subdomain? And I get a 404. What do I know? I know it exists and it has no slash, right? It doesn't have any default or index. So I know it probably is an API, right? Like, because it's not giving me anything else. No favicon, no, like nothing's coming, right? All right, so if I think this is an API, then I can start doing queries, right, by just typing things into the URL bar to see, am I going to get anything back off of this? So those of you that are familiar with GraphQL may be familiar with a concept called the GraphQL playground, right? This is sort of the user interface to create queries that you're going to probably programmatically make later, but this is sort of your burp suite into the GraphQL, right? I can do a bunch of stuff with this. And that's a really great idea, except what's wrong? It's public, right? Does anyone know how authentication works off of this? You're admin. If you can get the playground, you're the admin. So if you hang your playground out in the public, the administrators are the public now, right? And you get some of that, what is that? Free pen testing, where you don't get the reports. All right, so here's another one, right? So I'm going to, I don't know, someplace I found, slash GraphQL, and I get this. What happened? Anybody? Well, I sent it a GET, and it's telling me my query string is missing, right? You forgot your query string in this GET. I didn't even intend to do a GET. I just wanted to see if it was answered. All right, fine. So what am I going to do? Well, I have a GET query string that I keep in a text file here. Now, what do I have to do, everybody? What do I have to do if I want to throw a query string in this? Question mark. So maybe I'll do a slash question mark, and then that. Does that look like a lot? It's not. And then I hit enter, and I get the schema for the database. Right? And so the playground is dangerous, but misconfiguring GraphQL is dangerous. Right? I can now do a GET query against, this is an introspection query, so this is every possible thing that's available in the database. Right? It's the whole schema of the database. That is one of those things that should make you go, I wonder if we have GraphQL, right? And run out of the room and go see. But you know, maybe a little late. All right, so let's get back to the deck. Where am I at? So Kite Runner, one of their word list sections is how to find those GraphQL endpoints. Because it's not always just slash GraphQL, right? Obviously, I have staged these things to give this talk and hope they work, and tried to make them as simple as possible so that it wouldn't fail, obviously, right? But when you look at the word lists that Kite Runner generates to look at how you can go pull endpoints like that, and if you go look around on the internet for how to pull introspection endpoints, you can generate a word list that will find you every GraphQL playground in like 35 or 40 words. It's not a huge list, right? Because there's not a lot of people that are making it, right? So there's only a few places. But some of them are interesting, right? Like the first one that's in my list is Altair, right? Slash Altair. If you're running on specific platforms, that's the GraphQL playground, you know, launch. All right. So how do you not become a target is a good question, right? Because I've showed you that using just like DNS queries and a few words, I can hit endpoints that are going to be very interesting to me, right? So obvious endpoint names are one of those things that, you know, if your API is on api.yourdomain.com, I know where it is, right? Right? So protect that endpoint, be cognizant of it, understand the routes that are on that endpoint, understand what it does, right? And understand how to authenticate onto that endpoint and make sure that you're pushing that as much as you can. But then start to look at stuff like this, right? Slash GraphQL is an easy one. Swagger.json, health check. There are a couple of health check services out there. It's another one that I've been playing with quite a bit lately. There are health check services that will send you a text file that says okay. When you ask it, are you online, you get a text file back, a text file. If I ask it a billion times if it's online, what do I get? Well, I get a billion text files, right? This sounds like a DOS scenario to me. If I'm making your server generate something and give it to me, unless it's cached, but you wouldn't cache a health check, right? I mean, that would be stupid. So what happens if I try to go to an endpoint that there's nothing there, right? Like I just randomly type keyboard smash in and hit enter, right? What I get off of that, maybe it's on, right? And that keeps me there a little bit longer. What I really like to do for clients that we have that have this scenario in mind is I push splats, anything that wouldn't fall into their category, into a honey trap. And then I play with them, right? So they'll get the administrative interface for WordPress. And if they try to enter anything, they get the administrative interface for Joomla. And I just keep sending CMS interfaces at them. It's fun. And when you see somebody constantly keyboard smash on those, you just know they're not doing anything productive, right? And it feels a little better. Some of these targets, obvious potential targets like your Swagger file, you want to make sure that you protect that in some way. And what I like to tell people is, this is one of those things that should only be given to others under NDA. Take whatever controls you have for those types of items and apply it here, right? So if you normally would only share this under NDA, don't host it publicly, right? Take it down, put it behind some kind of gate, whatever that is, right? Maybe I've got to log in to get to the thing. But that just slows them down, right? You got to remember, security is all about, you have to be this tall to ride the ride. But tomorrow you're going to need to be this tall, right? And next day you got to be a little taller. We need to improve all the time. And these are the little improvements that remove a lot of your attack surface, right? So what we try to do is make sure that we know where everything is as kind of the first thing. What we've noticed is there's a lot of organizations that are being attacked on endpoints that they're unaware of or thought they turned off, right? So if you think of a path in an API and it's like v1 /login, right? And then there's a v5/login and there's a v16/login. Well, if you're sitting at v16, did you shut all those other ones off, right? And if you didn't, you need to, or you need to do something about it, right? Because that's going to end up being something bad for you. All right, so you got your target. What's going to happen? Well, I'm going to have a bunch of things in order to attack you, right? I have to have some kind of infrastructure. I've got to have IP addresses to come from that aren't the one from my house, right? Or off my phone or whatever. Where can I go get IP addresses? Anyone?
Amazon EC2.
I could go onto an EC2 cluster. That would be an easy way to do it. I pay for it, I'm there. Anybody else? Proxy services, man. Proxy services. You can buy proxy services and use IP addresses. So in my world, when we see attacks hit somebody, they come in as a single request. One request from that IP address, one request. But they're going to use 12 million IP addresses. I'm going to get 12 million packets, but it's all going to look like one request, right? So infrastructure is important to these guys, right? When they're attacking you, they have to have decent infrastructure, but good infrastructure is expensive infrastructure. If you go to Illuminati, who's now called Bright something, they have really expensive infrastructure that you can rent. And what it is, how many of you guys have seen advertisements for VPN services that are free? Okay, so if you read, and there's one out there called HOLA, H-O-L-A, VPN. If you read their terms and conditions, it explicitly says in there that you are now a proxy endpoint in the Bright network. They promise not to roll your phone over, and they're very guarded about it. Like I went and rented infrastructure from them and set a website up and attacked myself through their infrastructure so I could see what their IP addresses were. And they got really mad when I throttled it up real high and told me I had to stop. And then they realized who I was and they were like, you have to get off our network. But it didn't matter. I got the IPs. I'm going to need some kind of tooling. Could be Burp Suite. I could just be running intruder scripts, right? Or I could sit down and write some Python and figure this thing out. Behavior. Remember that single request attack I talked about? That's a behavior type, right? Rotating user agents is a behavior type. Doing things like trying to report that you are 3 or 4 different operating systems, even within those user agent strings, right, is a behavior type. And if we see that, we can always, ML just surfaces that stuff nice and easy. Credentials. I'm going to have to log in. I was telling somebody about this exercise I did during COVID, where what I wanted to do was be a bot as a human. because I thought it would be fun to figure out what are all the pieces that they've automated. Like, let's unautomate them and see how painful they are. So the first thing I need to do is get email addresses. Where am I going to go? Google. Go get some Gmail addresses, right? So you sit down with a web browser and you sign up for Google, and it asks you for a phone number. And if you put the next one, the same phone number, it won't let you create that account because too many accounts with the same phone number is something they don't allow. Dang it. But if you sign up through a Chromebook, it doesn't ask you for the phone number. So I went and bought a Chromebook, sat down in my house, I put in marysmith@gmail.com, bobsmith@gmail.com, and big spreadsheet of passwords and a big spreadsheet of emails, and I got to the 5th create and it wouldn't let me create it. And it gave me a CAPTCHA. And it started asking me questions. And I said, I can only create 5 accounts at a time. Crap. So I drove over to the police station and got on their Wi-Fi and created 5 more accounts. It was IP based. So I can run it through proxy. Wait, I'm not a bot, I can't do that. Crap. So then I had to drive to McDonald's. And then I had to go to the library. And I enriched myself in all of these places. But this is what it takes to do this kind of stuff. I gotta have a bunch of credentials so that I can log into these sites and do testing, right? My targets, the places that I'm gonna go, things like logins, right? I'm trying to do credential stuffing attack or whatever it is that I'm trying to do on the API. You're gonna see it on the login flow. Similarly, things like profile reads, right? What's OWASP API security #1 in the top 10 list? BOLA, right? Profile reads are how you figure out if you've got BOLA, right? Document enumeration. Are they asking for your Swagger endpoints from the same IP address? Because if they are, it's not me, right? It's somebody else. And then, we're going to try to figure out, are there logic attacks here? What's a logic attack? Anybody? It's business logic abuse is what we term it in the industry, but logic attacks are things like, I wonder if you have something in the back end that's going to catch me doing this. It's a good example. You remember the iPod? Does anybody remember the iPod? The Nano, there was one that was like this big. They got so small you'd lose them, but it was like that big, and it had a bad battery. And so Apple didn't want to have to deal with a whole bunch of people. They don't like that, right? It's expensive and a bunch of other reasons. So what they did is they set up a website, and they said, give us a credit card, type your serial number in. If it's a bad one, we'll send you a new one, and you send us the old one back, and if you don't send us the old one back, we're charging you for it. And this guy sat down, and he didn't have a credit card, but he had a Nano with bad battery. So he went down to this gas station, and he got a Visa gift card with $5 on it. He went back home. He typed the number in. Loon algorithm said, yep, that's a valid number. He ordered himself another one. And then what did he think? I wonder if I can do it again. I wonder if I can attack the business logic in this flow. He sent himself 500 iPod Nanos to his house. That's how he ended up in jail. Come on. Just send it to McDonald's and walk in and go, did you get a box for me? They said it's brought it here. I don't know. All right. So the attack example is we're going to go find an endpoint. I see a spec, and I can understand that maybe there's a thing in there that allows for me to create, edit, delete a user account, a profile, a something. So I want to go after BOLA, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to log in, and I'm going to use the API as intended. Authentication works. I get a session token or however you're doing your stuff. Nice. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that header, and I'm going to try to get there again without it. You'd be shocked how many times this works. Completely deleting the authentication token header oftentimes makes you an admin. It's fun. And then what I'm going to try to do is go horizontal, right? I'm going to try to see, can I see someone else's stuff? Normally, when I'm doing this as a tester, as a researcher, I sign up for a couple accounts and I mess with my own accounts, right? But if that isn't the case always, because it isn't the case always, what I try to do is go after IDs that are very low in number, right? Because those are like the admins or the original people that set this thing up or whatever, and I'm really not messing with anybody's stuff then. The docs are going to tell you where it is that you need to look for things and what is happening inside of those flows, right? So that's going to help us understand, oh, we're creating a user here. I wonder if there's a delete option inside of this API, right? How many of you guys know what crappy is? Matt does. Really? Just Matt? You guys said APIs earlier. I know you did. So how many of you guys know what WebGoat is? Bunch of you. That's really good. Crappy is the WebGoat for APIs. All right. So it's a really interesting implementation of like a car enthusiast board. And then you can go attack the crap out of it. It's nice. It's a great training thing, you know, because you get to source with it and all that. It's an OWASP project. So it's run by Inan and Erez, guy from Salt Security and guy from Checkmarks. I'm a sponsor on the project and do quite a bit with those guys on this thing. But this is one of those things where if you have a dev team that's working APIs and you want to teach them kind of wacky crap that you can do with APIs, this is it, right? I used to do a lot of that. I used to do a lot of teaching consulting. So I would sit down and I would teach developers how to hack a website. And my favorite thing in that is when the developer gets it and understands, oh, I get to be creative and mean, right? And then just starts going nuts with the thing. That's my favorite part, you know. Suddenly everybody's got cross-site scripting boxes popping up. Good stuff. So I originally wrote this talk for RSA, and they said, you gotta have a thing that tells people what to do. And I said, all right. So what should you do? When you get back to the office, you should look for your API specs. Where are they? Do you have them, right? And the answer is probably no. You probably don't have them, and that's fine. But if you start creating them, find a place to put them. Versioning and understanding where things are and all of that, you gain a lot out of having this, right? Just don't hang it out in the public. If you have specs, review them. And understand, is this the spec for the app as it's currently deployed, or is this the spec from like 5 years ago when we thought OpenAPI would be a thing we should try, right? You have to see, does it actually work? My organization makes a thing that will look at a spec and it will look at traffic and say, is this traffic conforming to the spec? That way you can easily identify it. It's an easy thing to do in the logs though. So you don't have to buy tools to do it. Specs should be internal, right? And internal means something different to everyone. If you have partners and they're under NDA, maybe you consider them internal. That's what I mean here, right? Keep it like that. Some best practices, embrace the spec, right? But establish policies around it. No API gets published without a spec is a simple policy, right? And there's lots of tools out there you can plug into your API or plug into your Nginx environment, and it'll build a spec for you by watching the traffic go by. So it's, you know, not that hard to do. Test against your spec, right? If you have a pen test coming up on this app, produce a spec for the pen tester, right? That's a really great, easy way to do that, right? Protect it, replace any defaults in your environment that are going to have panels on them, right? So GraphQL interfaces, those Explorer playgrounds, all of those kinds of things. There's even an OpenAPI one. If you're using OpenAPI server, there's an admin interface for it, right? If I find your Swagger file, I can probably figure out where your server is and get on the admin interface. And then manage the scanners, right? Use them to see what the attackers see. You want to understand how it is that you're being attacked. One of the things that I get to do for my organization is I do backlooks. So we'll look at an attack that happened at a customer, right? So we'll pull out I don't know, 50 million requests and run data science against them and try to figure out like what's happening here. What did they want to do? How are they trying to achieve it? How are they trying to avoid us? Right? All of those kinds of things. You have to be able to go back and watch the game tapes, right? And figure out where they worked and where they didn't. I just recently did a pen test engagement. I wasn't the pen tester. I was receiving the pen test as my client had us installed and said, we want you to watch this pen test because we want to know what they're doing, right? And it was with the Chinese government. This client was trying to put in a new software platform and a hardware manufacturing thing, and it would be sold to the public, and the Chinese government told them, you can do that if we can come pen test it. And they were like, I don't know if I want that, but they want the business. So they said yes. And we sat there, and I'm going to tell you right now, if you're worried about APT from China, please don't be. If you can block standard scanning tools, you're good. Most of the scanner tools that they ran against us, most of the things they ran against us were scanners. And none of the things that they did were what I would consider creative, like taking out a off header, right? Didn't do that. They don't even run burp. They just fire scanners at you. It's a weird thing. But I have all of that traffic, and I get to do backlooks on it and come back to the product team and say, hey, this is how we can catch this better, right? So I have a few recommendations, and you're going to see me say OWASP API categories, right, a couple of times through this. So we just did this massive exercise where we looked at the last 6 months of all of our customers' traffic, and we said, you know what? There are 3 API categories in the OWASP standard that if you have them, you're screwed, like really screwed, right? And I'm now going to give you the big secret. It's 2, 3, and 9. If you have those, you're really screwed, and especially if they appear all together. Improper asset management it's a pretty broad category, right? It's that we have V16, but we left V1 on. It's also, I left my GraphQL playground on. I left, there's a whole bunch of things inside of this that you really need to consider. What I like to make sure we do here is, very standard and clean things. HTTPS, right? Consistent naming conventions, things that are going to lead to code quality, because quality code is secure code, right? Methods and paths. This is another API 9. Right? Does anybody think 9 will be moving up in the next riff? I do. But make sure things are used as intended, right? I like the example that Matt gave yesterday. If there's an add on this user flow and I can add a user and I can view all users, can I delete all users, right? And don't test that, just randomly because it might work. Yeah. But lots of different stuff, right? Posts, puts, deletes, all of the different HTTP methods that you can use. Oftentimes, some of them are enabled when they shouldn't be, or they're enabled in a way that they shouldn't be. I've gone to a lot of organizations that gets don't work, but posts do, and you can run all of the same queries that you would normally run in the get in the post, just in the post body, and it works. And you get back data that's different than data that you would get in a different way. So it's important. Mass assignment is another one of these things it'll own you faster, right, if you have it. API 6, right? Open-ended parameter values, never a great idea. Being able to add things. Matt gave a great example yesterday about, you show up to a website or you're signing up for something on your phone and it asks you your favorite color and it has you pick it from a list. If you add things to that list, Matt's mean. He adds things to that list, billions of them, and then asks for the list again, right? It's a neat way to roll it over. I'm totally stealing that. So I have 2 slides that are marked as recommendation number 4, and they're copies. I don't know what happened. I don't know why it happened, but think about response bodies for a second. When I look at response bodies, I can end up with something called excessive data exposure. I did so you guys remember really early on, like March 20, I guess, we didn't have a way to go out to eat because we all had to stay home. Well, we did in some places. And I had to stay home and where I was. So when they decided they were going to open things back up a little, all of the restaurants now suddenly had to be able to serve you at the curb, right? And this was a real problem because they're used to you walking into the restaurant and ordering, and their point of sale system's right there in front of them. So a lot of these guys went to Clover, Toast, right? Those guys came out with stuff real fast so you could, do whatever it is that you wanted to do. I tell my friends all the time, go back in time 4 years, walk into your favorite bar, or better yet, call your favorite bar and ask them to bring you a double whiskey outside. Right? But I could do that after they opened things back up. I could get drinks, right? Suddenly it wasn't so, bad. So I ordered a hamburger and a beer from the place down the street, and I looked at the API call it made, and it had a lot of stuff in it. It was all stuff about the relationship with Toast and the company. It was what level they were at. It was what their service contracts had in it, right? So I looked at that and I said, that seems like an awful lot of data. That's an excessive data exposure, right? They're giving me so many things. Why? Why would that even be on there? And then I thought about it for a second and I said, they've got a mobile app that you could administer this thing off of, right? That's why it's all sitting there. I bet if I walked into the bar and said, can I see your Toast app, it would have all of that stuff on it. You're sending it to all of the every client that connects to that thing, when really you only need to send it to these guys. It's an interesting, strange case of why did you do that? All right, the last one, which isn't number 4. It's number 5. The API number 2 is broken user auth, right? You're not authenticating them, or you're authenticating them and you're just using some crap authentication routine that's never going to get you anything. So you start to look at how are you doing authentication on this flow, and what I oftentimes point out is stuff like this. Here we're using OAuth, right? You remember that V16, V5, V1 stuff I talked about from before? What if you weren't using OAuth on V1? And now you have a database of authentication credentials sitting there, right? That I can go after, right? These are bad things. You don't want to do that. So of the 5 things that I suggest that you do at the end of this one is important, right? You want to make sure your authentication is set up, but it's nowhere near as important as 9, right? Being able to find your API endpoints, I mean, this is the next thing I'm going to test, right? So if I can't find them, I don't test them. If you look at breaches that have happened really recently, right? There was a big breach in Australia. Has anybody heard of the Optus breach, right? So the Optus is a phone company in Australia, about 30 million clients, I think. Something like that. It's about 30% of Australia uses their service. They had an API endpoint that they were unaware of, public, no auth. And if you typed in a phone number, it would give you back the owner's location, their address, and all the things, right? IMEI, all the things. That breach has changed what Parliament is doing in Australia now, right? They are now legislating security into things because most of them got breached. Right? They're Optus people. So, if you confuse them with this stuff, they'll just legislate it away, right? Like that's how it works. for politicians. But when somebody stumbled across an API endpoint, they checked it, right? I work with a lot of phone companies. You'd be surprised, phone companies get attacked by bots constantly. And we deal with that quite a bit. And we do a lot of stuff with phone companies, and almost all of it is you have a flow with an endpoint that takes the phone number as an input and outputs something. And people will just sit there and type keyboard smash phone numbers into it all day, right? And eventually, they're going to get a bunch of data back. These guys figured out if I type in this phone number, I get back this data package, Python script, start with this number, end with this number, enter, right? Like that wasn't hard. I got it all. Also, they had no outbound detection of how fast the data was leaving, right? One of the things I've always wanted is a WAF that'll look at a response size and go, no, right? 12 megs is too big, right, for this output. I don't know. I'm not good at products, I guess. All right, so that's me, and I was talking about APIs. I've got about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to be able to ask questions or have you ask me questions if you wanted, and if you don't, then you should probably run over to the other room, because at 4, I guess, they end this thing. And we're 5 minutes from that. So does anybody have any questions? No one has the question. Hey, Jason, what happened to that accident you had earlier?
How do you handle pen testing multi-tenant SaaS vendors where basically the tenant name is the first part of the URL?
Yeah, so I actually am dealing with this with an organization that I deal with. They have 2,000 vendors coming through their platform, and each one has its own. And when you're pen testing something like that, you're going to do kind of like, I'm going to test it as a tenant as much as I can, and then I'm going to test to see if I can go right or left, right? And if I can go right or left, then all of the rules apply to the same vulnerabilities I found just going up and down the stack, right?
Did any kind of API rate limits help with solve any problems that you talked about, articulated or don't? Like, you know, the number of endpoints you can hit within a certain time point or anything like that?
Rate limiting is really hard because as soon as you tweak something to change the rate, and it's something that the attacker is in control of, they'll change too, right? They pivot just as fast as you do. I've seen pivots in less than 30 seconds. Like, we'll apply a policy and bang their back. It's crazy to watch. But the challenge with rate limiting is the one that I talked about earlier, where what happens when it's always a single request, right? Right, but it'll always just look like one single request, right? And scraping isn't illegal here, so there's not a lot of things that you can do to sort of slow down if it's just scraping. If they're doing something like logins, and you can tie on to something else, right? So this user came from 3 countries. All right, that's easy, right? This user came from more than 5 IP addresses in the last 3 minutes. That's easy, right? So you have to have something they can't pivot off in order to lock down the rates. Anybody else?
Another one. So do you also look at that SaaS vendors' forums or communities to see if some of the posts might have exposed some of the credentials? Or
Stop hacking follows.
Yeah, so a lot of times, like, if you look at that, Qualys is actually a pretty good example because they have multiple platforms. You could be on one of them. It's multi-tenant inside. They don't do that thing where, you know, it's driven off. So when you log in, you're on your platform. But it's definitely one of those things where if you're in an environment like that, yes, you read every document that you can, every forum complaint, you DM people that are complaining because you know they've been poking it. Yeah, there's plenty of things that you can do there. Anybody else? Yep.
Are you sure China isn't more sophisticated than that?
What's that?
Are you sure China isn't more sophisticated than that?
Man, I'm telling you, we sat and stared at the screen for, there were 8 of us on a Zoom call watching the data flow through, and I was like, are they gonna start? You know? And all we could figure is, well, all I could figure was they either had the B team on that day or something. They came from the same IP address. It was very well-known tools. I could see the...
That was a feint and they were really coming in another way.
And we thought that, and we went and had them pull all of their Nginx, everything that they could give us, and all of the counts matched up. So every transaction that came in was a transaction we saw.
Did they know you were watching them?
They knew that we were supposed to be doing something that they were going to have to get around. But they never, it never went past scanning tools, right? Like, it was very strange. I don't know what to take from that. I still am weirded out by it. But they passed, you know, my client got passed and he can build his stuff now, so we're good. But it was very strange.
Thank you, Jason.
Appreciate it.